The letter in her hand was stained with blood. Not hers, his. Margaret stepped off that train in Wyoming Territory expecting a husband. What she found instead would test every ounce of courage she had left. And before this day ended, she'd make a decision that would change 7 lives forever. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where this really started. 3 months earlier, Margaret was starving in Boston. Not the romantic kind of hunger you read about in novels, real starvation. The kind that makes your hands shake when you polish silver in someone else's mansion. The kind that makes you invisible. At 32, she was too old for marriage in Boston society, too poor, too forgotten. Then she saw the advertisement. Widower in Wyoming Territory seeks educated woman for marriage and homestead life. Must be strong of character. Room for negotiation on matters of the heart. Room for negotiation. Those words felt honest somehow. She wrote him that same night. John Patterson's letters arrived every 2 weeks like clockwork. He didn't write poetry, he wrote truth. The land was hard, the winters brutal. He had responsibilities, he'd explain when she arrived. But he promised her 3 things: her own room until she was ready, food on the table, and respect. That was more than Boston offered. But here's what he didn't put in those letters. What he couldn't bring himself to tell her. The train west took 6 days. Margaret wore her only good dress, navy wool that itched in the September heat. She watched America transform through dusty windows. Cities became towns. Towns became outposts. Green became brown, then gold, then endless. She practiced saying it, Mrs. John Patterson. The name felt like a costume she hadn't tried on yet. In her carpet bag she carried everything she owned, $12, 3 dresses, her mother's Bible, and every letter John had sent, tied with kitchen twine. She'd read them so many times the creases were wearing through. Sweetwater Station wasn't even a town, just a platform, a water tower, and wind that tasted like dust and distance. Margaret stepped onto that platform at 4 in the afternoon, September 14th, 1882. She'd remember that date for the rest of her life, and that's when she saw them. 7 children, lined up like stair steps from tall to small. The oldest, a girl maybe 14. The youngest, a boy, couldn't have been more than 3. They wore clothes that had been mended so many times they were more patched than original fabric. Their faces were scrubbed clean, but their eyes were old. Too old. The oldest girl stepped forward. She held out the letter. That's when Margaret saw the blood. You Miss Margaret Flynn? The girl's voice didn't shake, but her hand did. I am. Where's Mr. Patterson? Dead, ma'am. 3 weeks now, kicked by a horse. We buried him proper on the hill. The world tilted. Margaret's carpet bag hit the platform. But that's not the part that broke her. What the girl said next changed everything. This here's from Pa. He wrote it the day before he died. Asked me to give it to you if you came. The girl swallowed hard. He said you probably wouldn't come. Said we should wait 3 trains, and if you didn't show, we were on our own. Margaret took the letter. Her fingers left prints in the dust covering the dried blood. The handwriting was barely legible. Pain writing. Dying writing. Miss Flynn, I lied. Not widower. Never married. These children, not mine by blood, found them over years. Parents dead. Indian raids. Cholera. One just left by road. Couldn't let them starve. Couldn't let them go to orphan train east. You owe me nothing. But they need mother. Please. But that was it. No signature. The sentence just stopped. 7 pairs of eyes watched her, not begging, just waiting, like they were used to waiting, used to being left. Margaret had $12, enough for a train ticket back to Boston. Maybe enough for 2 weeks in a boarding house while she found another position polishing someone else's silver. She looked at those children, really looked. The oldest girl had positioned herself in front of the others, protective. Her dress was let down so many times there was no hem left. The second, a boy about 12, had shoulders already broad from work. His hands were calloused like a man's. Then she noticed something that made her decision. The smallest boy, the 3-year-old, was holding a wooden horse. Hand-carved, recent work. The paint was still bright. John Patterson had been dying and he'd been carving toys. What's your name? Margaret asked the little one. He hid behind the oldest girl's skirt. He don't talk, ma'am, she said. Hasn't since we found him by the burned wagon. Pa called him James, but we don't know if that's right. And you? Margaret asked the girl. Sarah, this here's Thomas, Mary, Elizabeth, Lucas, and Samuel, she pointed to each. And that's James. Sarah, how long since you've eaten? The girl's jaw tightened. We got some cornmeal left. We been managing. That meant days. It meant they'd been feeding the little ones and going hungry themselves. Margaret picked up her carpet bag. Well then, she said, I expect there's a house somewhere that needs a woman's touch, and a stove that needs lighting. Take me there. Sarah's face didn't change, but her eyes did. Something that had been closed opened just a crack. Yes, ma'am. The Patterson homestead was 3 miles from the station. They walked. The children carried her bag between them, trading off like they'd practiced. The house was, well, calling it a house was generous. 3 rooms, sod roof, gaps in the walls chinked with mud and grass. But it was clean. Desperately clean. The kind of clean that happens when children are trying to convince someone to stay. The cupboard held cornmeal and nothing else. The garden had gone to seed. 3 chickens scratched in a pen made of hope and wire. Margaret set down her bag and did what she knew how to do. She worked. She made cornmeal mush stretched with water and the 3 eggs she found. She tore her second-best petticoat into strips and hemmed Sarah's dress properly. She found where John Patterson had hidden his money, $40 in a coffee tin, enough for supplies if they were careful. The children watched her like deer watching a hunter, ready to bolt. That first night, after the children were asleep, Sarah came and sat by Margaret at the table. You leaving tomorrow? No accusation, just preparation. Why would I leave? Everyone leaves, or dies. Mostly dies, but sometimes leaves. Then, 14 years old and already carved down to brutal honesty. Margaret thought about lying, offering comfort, but these children had been lied to by life itself. I don't know what tomorrow brings, Sarah. I thought I was coming here to marry a man I'd never met because I was desperate. Turns out I'm still desperate. But here's what I do know. Right now, tonight, we're all warm. We're all fed, and that's more than I had in Boston. That's not a promise. No, Margaret agreed. But it's the truth. Sarah nodded. That was enough. The trouble came on the 3rd day. Margaret was in the garden trying to salvage what she could when a wagon rolled up. 2 men, official-looking. The kind of official that meant authority and no mercy. You, Mrs. Patterson? The first one called. Here's where Margaret made her second life-changing decision. I am. It was a lie. But it was also becoming true with every passing hour. I'm Clayton Moore, County Administrator. This here's Marshal Briggs. We heard John Patterson passed. We came to collect the children for transport to the orphan asylum in Cheyenne. Behind Margaret, she heard the door open, felt the children gathering. These are my children, Mr. Moore. They're not going anywhere. Ma'am, with respect, John Patterson wasn't married. These children aren't legally anyone's. They'll be better off in an institution where... Better off? Margaret's voice could have cut glass. Better off than on land that's paid for, with food and family. You tell me, Mr. Moore, what happens to children in those asylums? The marshal shifted uncomfortably. Everyone knew. The orphan trains. Children shipped east like cargo, handed out to anyone who wanted free labor. Some found good homes, most didn't. The law's the law, ma'am. That's when Sarah stepped forward with something that changed the game completely. Show them the license, Ma, Sarah said. Margaret had no idea what the girl meant, but she'd learned to trust her. Sarah disappeared inside and returned with a paper. A marriage license, filled out, signed by John Patterson, dated 3 months ago. The bride's name was blank. Pa got this when he first wrote to Miss Flynn, Sarah said, her voice steady as stone. Told me if she came and agreed, we'd fill in her name and have the circuit preacher sign it proper. Pa died before he could, but his intent was clear. It was a bluff. A magnificent, desperate bluff. Margaret took the paper. Her hand didn't shake. She'd been invisible for so long in Boston. Ignored, dismissed. Not anymore. My name is Margaret Flynn Patterson. This is my land, my home, and my family. If you have legal issue with that, you're welcome to take it up with the territorial judge. Until then, we have work to do. Moore looked at the paper, looked at the children, looked at Margaret standing there in a mended dress, backbone straight as a rifle barrel. I'll need to verify this with the county clerk. You do that. We'll be here. The wagon rolled away. Margaret's legs nearly gave out, but she stayed standing until it disappeared over the ridge. Will they come back? Little Elizabeth whispered. Maybe, Margaret said. Probably, but we'll be ready. Thomas, the 12-year-old who hadn't spoken more than 2 words, suddenly said, I can help. I can work harder. I can... You're 12 years old, Margaret said firmly. You work hard enough. All of you do. What you need to be is children, for whatever time you have left to be children. That night, she taught them a song her own mother had sung. Her voice was rough from disuse, but the children didn't mind. They sat around the table, cornmeal mush again, but with wild onions this time, and they sang. Little James, who hadn't spoken in a year, hummed along. The county clerk never came. Either Moore lost interest or someone higher up decided a widow working a claim was less trouble than 7 orphans on the county dime. Margaret learned to be a mother the way she learned everything else, stubbornly and completely. She learned which child needed firm words and which needed gentle ones. She learned that Thomas had nightmares about the cholera that took his parents, that Mary could calculate figures faster than most adults, that Lucas was afraid of storms, that Samuel collected smooth stones, that Elizabeth could gentle any animal, that James would talk when he was ready. And she learned that Sarah, tough as nails Sarah, sometimes cried silently in the night when she thought no one could hear. Winter tested them. The kind of winter that makes you understand why people wrote about the West with equal parts wonder and horror. They had enough food, barely enough firewood if they were careful. But then Samuel got sick, fever that spiked so high he shook with it. Margaret sat up 3 nights straight, cooling him with snow water, forcing willow bark tea between his cracked lips. On the 3rd night, Sarah found her crying. "He's going to die, isn't he?" Sarah's voice was flat, prepared. "No," Margaret said. "I didn't come 2,000 miles and fight off county administrators to lose him to a fever. He's going to live." "How do you know?" "Because I'm his mother, and I said so." But it wasn't medicine, wasn't science. But Samuel's fever broke at dawn. Spring came late but definite. Margaret stood in the garden, hands in honest dirt, and realized she couldn't remember the last time she thought about Boston, about her old life, about being invisible. The children were planting. Thomas was teaching James to make furrows. Mary and Elizabeth were arguing about seed spacing. Lucas was supposed to be helping but was watching a hawk instead. Samuel was collecting worms in a can because he was 7 and that's what 7-year-olds do. Sarah came and stood beside her. "You ever regret it? Staying?" Margaret looked at this girl who'd become her daughter, who'd learned to smile again, who'd started wearing the ribbon Margaret had bought her in town without being asked. "I came here because I had nothing to lose. I stayed because I had everything to gain." "We didn't have anything to offer you." "Well, you had everything, Sarah. You just didn't know it yet." That summer the circuit preacher came through. Margaret had the marriage license, still with her name written in Sarah's careful hand. She burned it. "Aren't you going to make it legal?" Sarah asked. "It's already legal," Margaret said. "In every way that matters. I'm not Mrs. John Patterson. I never met the man. I'm Margaret Flynn, and these are my children. If the law has a problem with that, they can come find us." Instead, she asked the preacher for something different. An adoption paper, 7 names, 1 mother. The preacher, who'd seen enough of life to know what mattered, didn't ask questions. He wrote it up proper. That night, they had a celebration. Biscuits with honey, a luxury. James, now 4, climbed into Margaret's lap. He did this sometimes, still silent but comfortable. She was telling them a story, making it up as she went, about a brave knight and a dragon, when James tugged her sleeve. "Mama," he said, clear as a bell. "Mama, is the knight scared?" The room went silent. Margaret's eyes filled, but she didn't let her voice shake. "Yes, baby, the knight is terrified, but he does the brave thing anyway. That's what makes him a knight." James nodded, satisfied, and rested his head on her shoulder. Sarah was crying. Thomas was pretending not to. Mary had her hand over her mouth. Elizabeth, Lucas, and Samuel were grinning like fools. "Well," Margaret said, voice thick, "I suppose the knight defeats the dragon. And they all live happily ever after." "Not ever after," Sarah said quietly, "but happy enough, for real." "Yes," Margaret agreed, "happy enough, for real." Here's the thing about this story that gets me. Margaret wasn't a hero. She was desperate. She was out of options. She made a choice not because she was brave, but because going back to Boston meant slow death by invisibility. But isn't that how most heroism works? You're not brave when you have good options. You're brave when you have terrible options, and you choose the one that matters. Margaret came west to disappear into someone else's life. Instead, she found her own, 7 times over. Those children didn't need perfection. They needed someone who stayed, who showed up, who chose them every single day, even when it was hard, especially when it was hard. Sometimes I think about Margaret standing on that platform, $12 in her pocket, a bloody letter in her hand. 7 reasons to run and no logical reason to stay. And I wonder what I would have done. I want to believe I'd have her courage, her stubbornness, her willingness to build a family out of nothing but need and determination. But the truth is, we never know what we're capable of until we're tested, until we're standing on our own platform with our own impossible choice. Margaret teaches us this. Family isn't who you're born to, it's who you choose, who you stay for, who you fight for when the county administrator shows up and the fever won't break and the winter won't end. She traveled 2,000 miles to become someone's wife. Instead, she became 7 people's entire world, and they became hers. If this story moved you, I'd love to know why in the comments. Do you think you would have stayed? Do you have your own story of someone who chose you when they didn't have to? And if you want more stories like this, stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things in the Old West, hit that subscribe button. Because history isn't just dates and battles. It's Margaret Flynn standing on a platform, making an impossible choice. It's a letter stained with blood, and 7 pairs of eyes, and one word that changed everything. Stay.